Hello guys, welcome to another video. And this one we're going to be discussing another unique item added to the core game in patch 3.24. That's the Tempest Rising unique boots, which drop exclusively from the Uber Awakener encounter. Judging by the availability of boss drops in Trade League, it looks like these boots are either as common or more common than the massive variant of the Thread of Hope Jewel, which would make it Uber Awakener's most common drop, or at least tied for most common drop. So the Tempest Rising boots are a new unique item that are themed around damaging ailments, and are most specifically targeted at bleed builds. They provide a decent chunk of movement speed, but the reason you want to use these boots is the last three modifiers. 5 to 25% increased duration of ailments on enemies, damaging ailments deal damage 5 to 25% faster, and you and enemies in your presence count as moving while affected by elemental ailments. So the first two of these three modifiers are pretty standard ailment scaling modifiers. Poison in particular benefits greatly from the increased duration, while the faster damaging ailments is fairly universal. However, the final modifier here is very specific to the bleeding ailment. You and enemies in your presence count as moving while affected by elemental ailments. Bleed has a special conditional damage increase which is dependent on whether the bleeding entity is moving or not. Baseline bleed deals damage per second equal to 70% of the base physical damage of the hit which inflicted it, as long as the target is stationary. However, while the target is moving, the bleed damage will be tripled, dealing 210% of the inflicting base physical hit damage per second. Crimson Dance is a keystone which removes the conditional while moving damage increase from bleeds that you inflict, whilst also halving the damage of bleeding, but allowing you to inflict 8 bleed stacks that all deal damage simultaneously instead of only one stack. This keystone serves as an option to make use of if you want to scale bleeding via faster ailment application and if you don't want to interact with the while moving mechanic. Meanwhile, for bleeding which is inflicted using a bow, the Ensnaring Arrow ability applies a debuff on the target which counts them as moving. So bleed bow builds have had the option to play a non-Crimson Dance bleed build using Ensnaring Arrow for maximum damage output on single targets. However, for melee bleed builds, for reasons unfathomable to everyone, a melee version of the Ensnaring Arrow debuff to count a target as moving doesn't exist. So those non-Crimson Dance builds have had to rely on weapon swapping to a bow to use Ensnaring Arrow to achieve maximum damage output, which is a not very enjoyable playstyle to say the least. Enter the Tempest Rising, a new option to consider for those builds, weapon swapping be damned. So the Tempest Rising then will mainly appeal to two build archetypes. Firstly, the aforementioned non-Crimson Dance melee bleed build, and secondly, Summon Reapoer builds which don't want to use a bow, enabling a lot more freedom in terms of gearing as you're no longer forced into using a bow. To benefit from the counting as moving mechanic on the Tempest Rising, the target must be inflicted with an elemental ailment. This may seem like a bit of a counterintuitive thing, needing to apply an elemental ailment on a build fully focused around physical damage. However, you can apply elemental ailments rather trivially in a multitude of ways. Summon Skitterbots is a reservation skill which summons 2 Skitterbots at your side, one chilling Skitterbot and one shocking Skitterbot. These Skitterbots will target nearby enemies, moving towards them and applying chill and shock in an area around the Skitterbots as an aura. This is a base chill of 10% and a base shock of 15%, and can be increased with gem levels or linked support gems such as Unbound Ailments or Bone Chill. Summon Skitterbots is often a decent reservation skill option for both damage and defense, especially as most of the builds that will consider this option won't have access to any other sources of increased damage taken on enemies, and therefore the shock is very impactful. Something worth mentioning here is the existence of Profane Proxy, a unique ring which will replace either the chilling or shocking Skitterbot, based on which ring slot it's in, and that Skitterbot will then instead apply a socketed curse in an area around it. This means that you can still make use of Skitterbots to apply an elemental ailment of your choice for the purpose of Tempest Rising, but also apply a full effect curse at the same time. There's also Venopuncture, another unique ring which goes hand in hand with the Tempest Rising. This ring grants some bleed chance, some increased bleed damage, and makes it so that you're chilled while bleeding, but it also makes your bleed inflicting hits also inflict chill as long as the target wasn't already chilled. If you're making use of a mace, you could instead spec into the Mace Wheel passive skill Mastery, which makes all damage dealt with maces inflict chill. Arctic Armour is a reservation skill which will drop chilled ground on your path while you move around, chilling enemies that stand on it. The Vessel of Vinktar unique flask will apply a shocking aura around you while it's active, but it will also cause you to be shocked, which can be very dangerous if you have no ways to deal with it, such as shock avoidance or reduced effect of shock on you. However, applying an elemental ailment to yourself may be beneficial, and that's because the Tempest Rising modifier, which counts enemies as moving while affected by an elemental ailment, also does the same for your character. There's not many while moving modifiers to take advantage of, and most of them are tied to the boot slot, which is already occupied by the Tempest Rising, so you can't make use of those ones. However, there are a few that you can make use of. The Soul of Ralakesh Pantheon power will make you take 25% reduced physical damage over time while moving, and make it so that moving while bleeding doesn't cause you to take the increased damage from the inherent while moving mechanic tied to bleeding. This means that if you had an elemental ailment on you, you'd always count as moving and always benefit from the 25% reduced physical damage over time taken. There's also some modifiers found on Abyssal Jewels which grant increased evasion rating, mana regeneration, or life regeneration while moving. And importantly, I've tested this in game, and if you're counted as moving through the modifier on the Tempest Rising, you'll still benefit from any while stationary modifiers while you're standing still, which means that these boots technically allow you to be considered as stationary and moving at the same time. You could then tie a bunch of these mechanics together. For example, you could make use of the Venopuncture ring to apply chill to targets that you inflict bleeding on. You could then also use the Golden Rule, a unique jewel which makes bleeding you inflict be reflected back to you, and makes you have increased armor while bleeding. The reflected bleed on you would then also inflict chill on you due to Venopuncture's modifier, and that chill would then enable the Tempest Rising's while moving modifier, which would then make the Ralakesh Pantheon be active all of the time. You could then also make use of the chill to grant increased action speed using another unique ring, Winterweave, which reverses the effect of chill. Obviously, this is just an example, and you'd need to be mindful of how dangerous the reflected bleed would be. One thing that I do want to discuss about these new unique boots is not so much about the mechanics, but rather how you acquire them. The Tempest Rising is an exclusive unique drop from Uber Cirrus, and while it's one of the common drops from this boss, it's still an Uber boss drop. I have to say that this placement of loot doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me in the context of the current state of Path of Exile. In a trade league scenario, this doesn't really matter all that much. After all, the strongest builds will farm Uber Cirrus for his rarest drops, and create a bunch of Tempest Rising boots in the process, and they'll become very cheap and accessible to be able to purchase and build around. However, in the context of loot hierarchy in the game, it doesn't make much sense that you'd be farming Uber Cirrus on a build which needs to be powerful enough to slay that boss comfortably, only to drop a pair of boots that you're unlikely to want to reroll into, as that would very likely be a weaker build than the one you're currently farming the boss on. It's a minor complaint, but I think it's a valid one. And I still hope for an ensnaring arrow type ability for melee to help enable those builds without using an Uber boss unique. Just a thought. What do you think of the Tempest Rising boots? And did I miss out some while moving tech? Let me know by commenting below. Thank you to my channel supporters over on Patreon, your support is very much appreciated. If you'd like to join them and grab some perks in the process, you can find out all of the information about becoming a patron. The link is in the description below. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.